Hi, welcome to another episode of Reinventing Your Home with me, Ross. This week we're making this big glazed door from sapele wood, so join me the next 20 minutes to see how we did that. Like most wood projects, we're starting with rough sawn timber, and what I'm doing here is just cutting a piece off of it just to make it a little bit lighter. This is a very heavy piece. Then the next thing is I needed a straight edge so I can run it on the table saw. Now normally you can get that straight edge by running it on a big jointer. However, I did not have one, so I did it with a circular saw. And then once that was done, I can run it on the table saw and cut all of my pieces for the door in preparation for milling. And once this was done, we go ahead on the jointer and spend about a couple of hours milling everything. As you can see, my jointer is not very big, so trying to mill that massive piece would have been a bit of a tricky one to do. That's why I prefer to cut my pieces pretty much to size before I do that. And then once all the milling is done, we can go ahead and create the rebate. So this is the rebate where our glass panels would sit. It's something that we need to calculate from the beginning. So this is what we're doing here with a router. So this is a technique that I've kind of developed on my own, which is running the router backwards a couple of times and then going forward. It puts a lot less stress on the router because this is my small 1/4 inch router, which is not really designed for that kind of work. And then we're doing the decorative molding, which is going to be on the inside of the door. And then after that, we're straight to mortise and tenons. Now on this door, we have, I believe, 32 mortise and tenon joints. And because we have that molding, we have to cut 45 degrees so we can meet the molding on the other piece, and we have a continuous molding. So this is what we're doing here on that particular one. I did not film the how I did the tenon, but don't worry, in the next shot you actually see how I'm cutting the tenons on the, it's actually on the bottom piece where we have a double tenon. It's a lot more interesting that way. So we have the 45 degree angle on the molding, then we mark the position for our mortise here. We can offer the piece with a tenon, which allows us to mark where exactly the tenon is going to line up here. I tapped it with the chisel, and then after that, now I don't have a mortising machine, which is funny because turns out my workshop neighbor does have one, and he offered next time I need it I can just borrow his because he rarely uses it. He's a cabinet maker and they rarely do any sort of traditional joinery like that. But anyways, because I didn't have a mortising machine, I was using my drill press, which you can do. It's essentially to pre-drill the mortise, remove the bulk of the material, and then after that you can go ahead with a chisel and square the hole and then cut it to size. So this is what I'm doing here now. I'll spare you from watching the whole process because it's not very exciting. It's essentially, once you get the hole pretty much there, you have to offer the piece, see where it touches, take a bit of material, and then keep doing that until the joint fits perfectly. But we get here to cutting the tenons. So this is the big piece. We have a double tenon on it, and then the first thing we need to do here is cut the shoulder. So I'm doing that on the table saw. I'm actually cutting the whole tenon on the table saw because this is sapele. It's kind of hard to work with, and it's a big piece. I don't want to do that by hand. So cutting all the shoulders here on the sliding side of my table saw, and I have this jig to actually cut the tenon. So first thing I had to do is figure out which clamps work with the jig. So the first one didn't work very well, so I had to change it for something a bit bigger, and then we run it and then we cut the tenon here. Gotta flip the piece. I didn't like how it was lining, so I had to move it like 1/2 millimeter. Flip the piece, cut the other side. Now if you do something like that, you have to have one of those jigs. It's an easy one to make. I would definitely advise you not to try and do it without one because we're too sketchy of a cut and you can potentially lose a finger. Now once this is done, we can go ahead and just clean up the tenon a little bit with a chisel here, or a router plane will do it just fine. Then after that, we have to cut a 45 degree angle for our molding. We have to flip the piece, remove that that bit here. Now luckily for that, the base of our tenon is where the 45-degree angle meets. As I've said earlier, we're having a double tenon on this piece, and for those of you who wonder what that is, essentially we would have two tenons that would have a gap in the middle. Now the reason we do that is because on our stiles, which are the long bits, we have to cut a mortise, and that is a big hole. So by leaving a gap in between the tenons means that we can leave some material in between the two mortises, which gives the style a bit more structural integrity. Otherwise we could potentially compromise it by cutting that massive hole and removing all of that material. Now we're pretty much done with the tenons here. I like to break the edges, they go into the mortise a bit easier that way, so this is just my personal preference. And then it's the same process here on the drill press. I've got it all set up. Now one thing I had to do here is I figured out the height of the table on my drill press, and I made a box which was the exact same height. That allowed me to run that long piece and not worry about anything, in case you wonder how I'm holding it. On the other end, I'm not, it's just sitting on a box that's been purposely made at the same height. And it's essentially we're doing the same thing. We're trying to remove as much material as possible. Those mortises are quite deep. I normally like to cut my mortise and tenon joints by hand, and I'm doing most of the small bits by hand. However, the structural element of that, and as I said, they're quite deep, it saved me a lot of time. It would have taken forever to cut those deep mortises by hand. And then once we all drilled up here, it's the same process. We have to square the holes and then slowly make sure that the joint fits together. It's a tedious process. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but it's essentially, this is what it is. On our long piece that goes in the middle of the door, however, I had to cut the tenons using a different method. See, that piece was about 1.6 meters long, so if I was to attach it to my jig and trying to run it on the table, so I would have hit my ceiling. So I had to use something else, and in this case I'm using my miter saw, and I believe this is called the trenching feature, which essentially is a depth stop, which allows you to do a bunch of passes and cut it that way. It's usually used for rebates, but it worked a treat for those particular tenons. Now those ones didn't need to be as deep as the other ones, so I left them a bit shallower. And as you can see here, it's the same thing. We have to cut the 45-degree angle on the molding, slightly clean it up here, flip it over, because this has the molding on both sides as it goes in the middle. So we do exactly the same thing on the other side, cut the 45-degree angle. So I'm using this block, which is a very simple thing. You just cut a block at 45-degree angle on your miter saw and just use it as a guide where you can clamp it to the piece and then run your saw against it. That way you can get your 45-degree angle cuts. Now we need to transfer that to the piece that the tenon goes in, and what we have to do here is find the center of the board. We align it with the piece and we can mark it here, and then we can transfer those measurements with the combi square. And the fun thing about that is that gives us the positioning of the bottom of our 45-degree angle. So what we need to do here is just align our guide block with those lines and then cut the 45-degree angles. As you can see here, after that we have to chop off all of that material before we cut our mortise. Now I was contemplating a bunch of different ways I could have done that. I was thinking about using my multi tool and coming from the back and just cutting it that way. Eventually what I did do, and it worked very well actually, was chop it off with a chisel. So what I'm doing here is, it might seems like I'm doing it carelessly, but I'm not. I'm being careful. I'm chopping it off just before where I need it to be, and then after that I would go over and then smooth it. As you can see here, this is some final cuts here. I'm being very careful while I'm checking with my little square, just to make sure that it's nice and flat. And then once we do that, we can go ahead and mark the position of our mortise. So as you can see here, I've already set up my marking gauge, so all I had to do was just run it on both sides of the piece, and then after that we can jump straight onto the drill press and then pre-drill our holes. On this particular piece we did not need the mortise and tenon joint to be that deep, so we made it slightly shallower, and I could have actually done it by hand. However, I had already set up my drill press, so I thought I would just use that one instead. As you can see here, I've removed most of the material, and then what I'm doing here is I'm just going over with a chisel, squaring the hole, cleaning up the sides, and then slowly getting the joint to fit together. Now, as I said, I could have done that by hand. On these, some of the big ones, just it wasn't worth it. It was just quicker and more efficient that way. On the smaller mortise and tenon joints, I did them by hand. I had 24 of those to make, but you'll see that in a minute. So in here we're pretty much done. The mortise has been cut. We just have to adjust the tenon slightly. I was trying a couple of different methods. Normally I like to use a router plane. However, I've got a little small router plane that's usually good for cabinet doors. I need to get a big one for those type of doors, but I don't make enough of them to justify it. So that's why I was using a chisel instead of a router plane. A router plane would have been much better. However, mine is a small one for cabinet doors, and it wasn't very comfortable to use on those slightly larger pieces. But anyways, the chisel would do just fine. As you can see here, it was okay. Just a couple of test fits, remove some materials, and then eventually we got to the point where the joint would fit just fine. And then we're off to making the small bits. So those are the individual glass panel dividers. I have no idea what they're called. If you do know that, and if you want to let me know in the comments, I would appreciate that. So we cut them slightly oversized, and then I'm getting them through the jointer. On these ones, I'm cutting the rebates for the glass on the table, so I thought it would be safer that way than using the router. I could have done the big pieces as well. That's one of the ways you can do those rebates. But on the big ones, I prefer using the router. On these ones, I thought it'd be safer on the table. So after that, we have to add the decorative molding that we have all throughout the door, and this is what the general shape of our small piece is. So after that, we go ahead, we have to cut the 45-degree angles, which is the start of our tenon. And as you can see here, I'm using my guiding block, which was used all throughout. So once we cut the 45-degree angles, I would join them in the middle with my square, just to make sure that they're aligning properly. And then we have to cut the sides. That way we can expose the miters, and we kind of get an idea now what the tenon is going to look like. We can clean up a little bit here with the chisel, and after that, mark up the position of the tenon. Then go ahead and actually cut it. Now this is one of those rare projects that I actually enjoyed using my pull saw. I'm not normally a big fan of, but who knows, maybe in the future I will be using more. Maybe I'll get some of those Japanese style pull saws. And this is a method I was using here. It's called the knife wall. I've learned that from Paul Seller. This is a nice way of getting a crisp shoulder here. So I would highly recommend you watch his video on that. He would explain it a lot better than I do, and it's something I've learned from him, so I don't want to take credit for that. So this is the shape of our tenon. What we need to do here is just clean it up slightly with a chisel, and then after that we can transfer it to the piece that it would go into. So once we do that, yeah, again we have to cut the 45-degree angles. You'll probably be sick of me saying that by the end of this video, but we cut the 45-degree angles here, and then after that we use a big chisel and then remove that material, because this is where the little piece would sit into, and you'll actually see the joint. It's very satisfying once we get a nice and tight joint. So once we do that, we can mark the position of the mortise, and all of those mortises I did by hand. So on the small pieces, again, they're not very deep mortises, they didn't need to be that deep, so I've decided to cut them by hand. It would have been easier. I don't think that there wasn't any need for me to do that on the drill press, and I also enjoyed it. Now, I'm a big fan of traditional joinery, and when I'm making stuff that requires any of those joints, whether that being mortise and tenon or dovetail or half lap joint or anything else, I do try and make them by hand. Now, I'm not against using machines, so you know, if you're into that kind of stuff, good for you. I'm not against it. I'm not saying this is better and you shouldn't use machines. I just like it. It's something I enjoy doing. So if I can get the chance of doing it by hand, I will do it that way, just for fun. But anyways, I'm gonna shut up for a minute so you can actually hear how this joint goes in together. Look at that beautiful joint. Safe to say I was very happy with it. Now, once I was done cutting all the pieces, I go to the fun part, which is assembling and gluing up the whole door. Now, this is something I found out while I was dry fitting it, and that was that the door would only go in one way. And because it was such a big door with so many components, I was stressing out a bit. I was worried that the glue might start setting up prematurely, but that was fine. It only took me half an hour, which was plenty of time for me to assemble the door without the glue setting. And then you can see me here using pretty much all of my clamps. And then what I'm using here is a technique that was used normally on traditional windows and doors, and that is putting dowels through the frame, through the mortise and tenon joint. Now, did I really need to do that? I don't know, but it wasn't gonna hurt, so I went ahead and put 2 dowels on each of those 4 main joints that we have on the frame. Now, when this was done, I had the door pre-painted. I wasn't gonna bore you to death looking at me painting a door white. And then we skip ahead to installing the glass panels here. I had the glass cut for me. You can see me here using a bead of silicone, and I'm putting the glass on top of it. Normally on these traditional doors and windows, you would have worked with putty, with the linseed oil putty, and a lot of people don't know about that, but putty takes upwards of 28 days to dry properly, and that is if you have good weather. I live in England and it was October, so we did not have good weather. So instead I've opted for quadrant, which I'm cutting here, and then I'm nailing with a nail gun as a way of making sure that we don't have to wait 2 months before we can actually paint the door on site. So as we're getting to the end, I wanted to let you know what the price of this project was. The price for our customer, including delivery, installation and painting, was about £1,600. I would appreciate if you leave me a comment saying whether you think this is expensive, cheap or reasonably priced. However, I would ask you not to put the price in the comment. That way I would know anyone who's commented has watched the video to the end. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one.